Story 1. The name on census. The patient in bed 14 did not raise her voice, threaten staff, or ask to leave. She simply looked at the overnight census in my hand and told me not to cross her name out this time. Snow was blowing hard enough against the third-floor windows that the whole ward gave off a faint mechanical shudder. Behind me, the nursing station printer began feeding out a fresh census sheet all by itself. I remember the sound of the paper more clearly than I remember my own breathing. When I picked it up, the line for bed 14 was blank again. The woman in the room smiled at the empty doorway beside me and asked whether Darlene had finally stopped pretending she could not see her. I had been a psychiatric charge nurse for 11 years, and by the winter of 2026, I trusted routine more than I trusted instinct. Routine was how a locked unit stayed predictable. Routine was how you moved 12, sometimes 14. Acutely ill patients through a long overnight without missed medications, elopement attempts, restraint events, or preventable injuries. At Harrington State Psychiatric Hospital in Bangor, Maine, routine lived in checklists, shift reports, medication administration records, bed management updates, and half-hourly safety rounds. It lived in the hum of fluorescent lighting, in the squeak of the medication cart, in the dull plastic smell of fresh wristbands. If a nurse did her job properly, very little on the unit should ever surprise her. That week, a snowstorm had started pushing inland from the coast just after sunset. By the time I drove in for my shift, the roads were coated in a hard white glaze that turned every intersection into guesswork. Harrington sat a little outside the busiest part of Bangor, a state facility built in additions rather than in a single plan, so every wing seemed to belong to a slightly different decade. The adult psychiatric ward where I worked was on the third floor of a newer section, though newer in our hospital still meant scuffed linoleum, old badge readers, and heating vents that clicked loudly whenever the temperature dropped below 20. My shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. That evening, charge report came from Darlene Pike, who had the kind of memory every floor relied on but never properly rewarded. She gave report in a calm, steady tone while pulling off her reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. 12 patients in house, she told me. 2 on close observation. 1 new medication order at 10 that night. No assaults, no seclusion, no transport calls pending. Weather had already thinned the staffing pool, so administration approved reduced overnight coverage. That left me with 2 nursing assistants, Marcus Bell and Joelle Haskins, and no float nurse unless the storm eased. I printed the census myself at 11:10. I remembered doing it because the printer jammed on the first attempt and left a black toner streak down the margin. 12 occupied beds, 4 vacant. I counted the names against report, then did my usual physical walkthrough before first medication pass. 12 patients. Bed 14 was stripped, turned over, and empty, with a folded blanket stacked at the foot because housekeeping had not yet taken the discharge. Linen bag. The ward settled early that night. Most of our patients disliked storms. The pressure change and the darkness outside the reinforced windows seemed to heighten agitation in a way no physician ever fully explained. But this time the unit was unusually quiet. By midnight, 1 patient had asked for as needed anxiety medication. Another needed reassurance that the roads would be plowed by morning. And 1 man in bed 6 had placed a towel at the bottom of his door because he said the light from the hallway looked hostile. Those were manageable problems. Those were the kinds of problems I understood. At 1:15 in the morning, I started routine safety rounds. Marcus took the South Hall. I took the North Hall and the 4 single rooms nearest the seclusion suite. On a psychiatric unit, you learn to observe while appearing not to intrude. I would stand at a doorway just long enough to confirm respiration, posture, and obvious distress, then mark the round sheet clipped to my board. Bed 11 asleep on left side. Bed 12 awake, reading. Bed 13 in restroom, no concern. Then I reached bed 14. A woman was sitting upright in the bed that had been empty less than an hour. Earlier, she was not agitated. She was not disoriented. She sat with her hands folded over the blanket and looked toward the door with the patient. Stillness I usually associated with people who had already been on a unit for several days and had learned its rhythms. The room light was off, but the corridor glow outlined her face well enough for me to see she was middle-aged, pale from hospital lighting, hair tied loosely at the nape with a standard elastic from our admissions kit. She wore a hospital gown, non-slip socks, and a white wristband on her left wrist, she said, very politely, that storms made it hard to sleep. I checked the wristband. Patricia Aldrin, patient number 88443. I told her I would return in a moment. She nodded as if I had just completed an expected part of some longer conversation. Back at the nursing station, I looked at the census sheet on my clipboard. Patricia Aldrin was listed in bed 14. I am aware how weak that sounds after the fact. A name appeared on a list. A patient occupied a bed. In any normal hospital explanation, I had simply missed an admission or received incomplete report. But we had a locked unit. Admissions were not casual events. They required physician acceptance, intake documentation, contraband search, property inventory, a nursing assessment, and a bed placement update entered both on paper and in the electronic system. No one simply appeared in a room. I checked the electronic chart. A patient file existed under the wristband number. There was a demographics page, an allergy field marked no known drug allergies, and a diagnosis entered as unspecified psychotic disorder. The admission timestamp read 1:42 in the afternoon that same day. There was no intake note, no physician history and physical, no nurse admission assessment, no transportation log, no belongings inventory, and no bed request ticket from emergency services. I called Darlene at home. I would not normally wake an off-duty nurse during a blizzard, but I needed to know whether I had somehow missed a handoff. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding half asleep and immediately annoyed. I told her the patient name and the bed assignment. There was a long silence. Then Darlene said bed 14 had been empty when she left. I told her the electronic record showed an afternoon admission. She repeated, this time more slowly, that if an afternoon admission had occurred, she would have known. She had worked until 7:30 and given me report on 12 patients. She did not tell me I was wrong. She told me she had no explanation. I documented the discrepancy as an incident. I recorded the name, wristband number, room assignment, and all missing components of admission paperwork. I assessed Patricia in person after that. Her affect was calm, speech normal rate and volume, eye contact sustained, no visible tremor, diaphoresis, or confusion. She denied pain, denied thoughts of harming herself or anyone else. When I asked where she had been admitted from, she said, from downstairs first, and before that from the road. When I asked who had brought her in, she said, the same as before. That answer should have raised a thought disorder concern, but she did not present as disorganized. She sounded as if she were answering accurately within a context I lacked. The storm worsened after 2 in the morning. Wind hit the north side of the building hard enough to create a low-pressure moan in the window frames. Joël made coffee that tasted like warm cardboard and set 1 cup beside me without asking. Marcus reviewed the camera feeds in the day room alcove, because we had 1 patient on intermittent observation who liked to wander. I asked him to go back through the transport corridor view from midnight onward. He did. No patient transfer, no security officer escort, no intake nurse bringing someone upstairs. We checked the elevator camera, the Sally Port camera, and the east stairwell landing. Nothing. At 3 in the morning, Patricia asked whether I was still using the old round sheets with the blue grid boxes. I said yes. She said Darlene always pressed too hard with her pen and tore the paper near the corners. That was true. It was also not information an undocumented patient should have had. The morning shift arrived late because road conditions were still poor. I gave report to a day nurse named Elena Foster and included Patricia as a patient pending administrative clarification. Elena frowned at the chart, then at me, then at the empty room behind me. She asked where the patient was. I told her bed 14. Elena walked to the room and looked inside. When she came back, her expression had changed into something I still have trouble describing. Not disbelief exactly, more like embarrassment on my behalf. She said the room was empty. I walked back there with her. Patricia was in the bed, lying on her side, eyes open, looking at the window. Elena looked directly at the bed and repeated that the room was empty. I did not argue in front of staff. I finished report, signed off, and drove home through snowbanks high enough to turn the roads into white corridors. I remember the whole drive because I spent it telling myself that exhaustion can produce strange edges around perception, and that once administration sorted the paperwork, all of this would become irritating rather than frightening. When I returned the next night, Patricia was still assigned to bed 14. Darlene avoided eye contact while giving report. She handed me 13 names this time and moved on without commentary, as if the cleanest solution was to behave as though the census had always included Patricia. During rounds, however, when I asked whether she had given 8 o'clock medications to bed 14, Darlene said, very carefully, "To whom?" That was the first moment I began to understand that the problem was not simply documentation. It was recollection. Over the next 4 shifts, the discrepancies widened. Patricia's chart populated itself in fragments. A vital signs entry appeared under a float nurse who denied ever laying eyes on her. A physician progress note briefly showed in the record, then vanished before I could print it. Her medication administration record listed 2 doses of quetiapine entered under my login on a night when no physician had placed an active order. Information technology pulled the login audit and found nothing abnormal. According to the system, I had documented exactly what the chart displayed. Marcus admitted one night that he remembered hearing Patricia cough from her room, but could not remember ever seeing her face. Joelle said she thought the room looked occupied at the edge of her vision, and then ordinary whenever she turned to look directly at it. Darlene took the opposite position. She claimed no patient by that name existed, yet once while handing me narcotic count, she absent-mindedly asked whether your quiet 1 in 14 had slept any better. I started printing hard copies of everything, census updates, medication administration records, incident reports, bed management summaries. I placed them in a manila folder inside my locker because the versions in the electronic system never held steady for more than a shift or 2. Sometimes Patricia's name was present. Sometimes the line space where her name should have been looked oddly compressed, as if text had been deleted and the form had tried to heal over it. She remained calm throughout. That was part of what made her so difficult to defend in ordinary clinical language. If she had screamed, threatened, or made impossible claims, I could have anchored the situation to familiar psychiatric terms. Instead, she behaved like a long-term patient with good insight into hospital life. She knew medication pastimes before I announced them. She knew which psychiatrist rounded late on Thursdays. She knew Marcus kept peppermints in the locked drawer where we stored patient razors. She called me by my first name on the second night, though I wore only my last name and title on my badge. "How do you know my name?" I asked her. She looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "You tell me every time," she said. I requested historical census archives through administration. Gerald Sloan, our unit supervisor, treated the matter as a documentation quality issue and seemed primarily interested in whether my reports exposed the hospital to liability. He told me to rest, to avoid becoming over-focused, and to let systems review do its work. I asked whether anyone had ever flagged irregular occupancy in bed 14 before. He said not to his knowledge. He also said that in the middle of a winter staffing crisis, he needed his charge nurses grounded and solution-oriented. It was the sort of managerial sentence that sounds supportive until you hear what it is actually doing. The archives came 3 days later in the form of scanned downtime packets from past weather emergencies. The paper backup forms we used when electronic systems went partially offline. I reviewed them in the staff education office because I did not want anyone interrupting me. Most were unremarkable. But during a major blizzard in the late 1990s, I found a handwritten census sheet from this same ward listing 14 occupied beds, when the formal occupancy report for the same date listed 13. Bed 14 contained the name Patricia Aldrin. Attached to that sheet was an incident addendum stating that a medication variance had occurred because patient Aldrin not visible to all assigned staff at all times. The sentence had been crossed out and replaced with bed status discrepancy resolved. I pulled more years. Another winter storm, another reduced staffing event, another census irregularity. The name recurred at intervals that made no clinical sense. Not yearly, not consistently, but always during weather closures, staffing shortages, system downtime, or unit transfers. Always Patricia Aldrin, always bed 14. even during years when the ward numbering system had briefly been different and 14 should not have existed in its current form. I took the copies home and spread them across my kitchen table. My husband, who worked nights in a completely different field and had long since accepted that hospital stories were best heard only if invited, asked whether I had slept. I told him not yet. I did not know how to explain that I was less frightened of the patient than of the possibility that the institution already had an approved language for erasing her. The next shift, I went directly to Patricia before first rounds. I sat in the chair by the window, maintained appropriate distance, and interviewed her as formally as I could. She told me she had been admitted because the roads were bad again. She told me she had once had another room on a lower floor before the renovation. She told me certain staff members forgot her more quickly than others. When I asked whether she was aware that some people denied seeing her, she said yes. When I asked why, she gave the only answer that ever sounded rehearsed. Because the hospital does not like unfinished counts, she said. That phrase stayed with me. Unfinished counts. I reviewed bed management policy, old Sentinel event memos, closure procedures, even renovation notices from when the newer wing had been built. In a packet from the early 2000s, buried in a quality improvement summary with 3 unrelated safety items, I found a reference to an unresolved patient location discrepancy during a storm evacuation many years earlier. No name, no final finding. The memorandum language was dry enough to make almost anything sound minor, but one line stood out. Staff were advised not to continue duplicate searches after administrative reconciliation of census totals. Not after the patient was found. After the totals were reconciled, I confronted Gerald with that memo and the archive sheets. He looked tired more than alarmed. He said historical paperwork from state facilities could be contradictory. He said I was building a pattern where there might only be clerical residue. Then he asked, in a tone I have heard supervisors use on impaired colleagues and unstable patients alike, whether I was sure I had been getting enough sleep. That was when I understood the full shape of the gaslighting. No one needed to call me incompetent. They only needed to keep locating the problem inside my level of rest, my stress, my interpretation. If enough records contradicted me, and enough people remembered selectively, then my confidence became the only unstable thing anyone had to examine. 2 nights later, at the height of another wind warning, the printer at the nursing station activated without a command. A fresh census sheet fed out, 13 names. Then Patricia Aldrin in bed 14, then 2 blank lines. I picked it up and went straight to her room. She was already awake. You should keep that copy, she said. By morning it will be easier for them if it tears. I asked her what she meant by that. She looked past me toward the nursing station, toward sounds she should not have been able to hear from her room. You always try to prove I was here, she said. Then they tell you a count is a count, and you decide not to be difficult. I told her I had never made that decision. She gave me a sad, patient expression I had seen many psychiatric nurses give frightened new admissions. You have, she said, more than once. I do not know what made me do it, but I opened the paper folder I had brought from home and laid the old archived census sheets on her blanket one by one. She touched the old page with 2 fingers and smiled faintly. On the final sheet from a storm 3 winters earlier, there was a medication notation in the margin. The handwriting was mine, not similar to mine. Mine, I had written patient calm. Will hold further discussion until daylight staffing. I had dated it with the correct year. I had initialed it with the exact hurried curl I used at the end of every overnight note. 3 winters earlier, I had no memory of Patricia Aldrin. By dawn the wind had eased. The roads opened. Administration declared normal operations. Bed 14 was listed vacant on the morning census. Patricia's chart would not load. My printed copies from the night before had water damage across the center as if they had been left in melted snow, though they had remained inside my locker until I removed them myself. Gerald told me there was no basis for further review. Darlene told me, kindly now, that I looked exhausted. Marcus asked whether I was all right, then hesitated and said he had the strange feeling we had already had that conversation. I still work nights, though not on that ward anymore. Harrington renovated the North Hall the following summer. and bed 14 became a storage alcove for extra linens and a broken restraint chair. Nobody wanted to inventory. On paper, that solved the discrepancy. Institutions are very good at solving things on paper, but every winter, when weather threatens and staffing thins, and the hospital starts speaking in the language of contingency, I think about unfinished counts. I think about how easily a system can decide that balancing the numbers matters more than accounting for the person who made them uneven. And I still cannot tell you whether Patricia Aldrin was a patient the hospital kept forgetting, or a memory the hospital kept admitting whenever conditions were right. I can only tell you that sometimes, just before dawn, I still hear the printer start on its own. Story 2, The Silent Attendance. The first time I understood that part of a group session had gone missing, all 6 patients were staring at the empty chair beside me, as if someone had just said something perfectly reasonable from that space. I was holding a stack of laminated emotion cards for a weekend coping skills group. Outside the windows, the foothills west of Colorado Springs were turning gold under late autumn light. Inside the room, no one was frightened. They were attentive, almost polite. One patient nodded thoughtfully and said, "That makes more sense than last week." I asked who he was responding to, and every person in that circle looked at me with the same mild concern I usually reserved for patients who had lost the thread of a conversation they were supposed to be leading. In the autumn of 2025, I worked as an occupational therapist at Juniper Crest, a private psychiatric rehabilitation facility on the north side of Colorado Springs. We were not an acute hospital. We sat in the long, controlled middle ground after crisis and before ordinary life, where people relearn schedules, self-care, frustration tolerance, medication routines, and the practical mechanics of being with other people again. Our programs mix structured therapy with repetitive tasks on purpose, grooming groups, community reintegration planning, meal preparation exercises, fine motor tasks, executive functioning drills, memory supports. We were less dramatic than inpatient psychiatry and, in my opinion, more revealing. There is nowhere to hide from yourself during a 40-minute sequencing task if your mind is unreliable. I covered the adult mood and trauma unit on alternating weekends, partly because I liked the pace, and partly because weekend coverage exposed how well the treatment plans actually worked once the full weekday machine was gone. Fewer supervisors, fewer family calls, fewer administrative eyes. What remained was process. Could the patients organize themselves for a simple baking activity? Did they remember grounding exercises without prompting? Could they tolerate silence without turning it into conflict? Juniper Crest was a low-rise private facility, stucco exterior, broad windows, landscaped courtyard, all designed to look less institutional than it truly was. The therapy gym smelled faintly of disinfectant and yoga mats. The art room always carried a trace of tempera paint, no matter how often environmental services cleaned it. Group Room B, where most of this happened, had stackable chairs, a whiteboard, a locked cabinet for sensory tools, and a wall clock that ran 3 minutes fast because maintenance never quite fixed it. I had worked there 4 years. I knew the sound each door made when it closed. I knew which patients needed visual schedules and which needed the schedule removed, because the sight of a full day made them panic. On the first Saturday of November, I came in just before 8 in the morning, reviewed weekend treatment objectives, and printed the attendance sheets for my groups. We did not run full formal therapy on weekends, but occupational therapy still carried a dense structure. 9 in the morning coping skills, 10:30 life roles and routines, 1 in the afternoon meal planning, 3 in the afternoon sensory regulation. The patient list for the first group included 7 names. 6 belonged to active treatment plans I had reviewed the previous evening. The 7th was Nolan Wren. I knew the name only because I did not know it. In psychiatry rehabilitation, unfamiliar names happen. Census shifts. Insurance authorizations change. Weekend admissions get placed before the full paperwork reaches every discipline. I checked the electronic chart. There was a demographic shell, a room number, and a medical history section that had not yet been completed. No occupational therapy evaluation. No interdisciplinary treatment plan. No recreation note. No psychiatry intake that I could see. I assumed the admission packet was simply incomplete. That was common enough on weekends. At 9, 6 patients took their chairs in group room B. I counted 6 bodies, 6 cups of decaffeinated coffee, 6 sets of restless hands. But when I took attendance, everyone waited after the 6th name. Nolan Wren, I said. From the far side of the circle, a woman named Paige answered. He's here. She gestured to the chair at my right. The chair was empty. There are moments in psychiatric work when it matters very much what your face does. Mine did nothing. I marked attendance as present because the entire group seemed settled by that response, then moved on with the exercise. We reviewed grounding prompts using object identification, temperature change, breath pacing, and environmental naming. Midway through, a patient named Curtis offered an unusually insightful comment about how memory becomes less trustworthy when you keep checking it. Before I could reinforce the observation, someone beside me spoke in a low, even voice. Only if you are checking the same memory. I heard it clearly. The voice sounded close enough that I turned toward the empty chair. No one reacted as if anything remarkable had happened. Paige nodded. Curtis said, "Write that too." Another patient wrote something on his worksheet. I made the clinically foolish choice in that moment, which was to continue the group rather than stop and challenge the reality of what I had heard. I told myself fatigue could generate odd impressions. I told myself one of the patients might have spoken from across the circle, and I had mislocalized the sound. After group, I completed my progress note. 7 attended, moderate participation, good engagement with grounding concepts. When I reached the intervention section, I paused, unable to remember who had made the most useful comments, not just the quiet voice. I could not recall the exact progression of the conversation for a span of perhaps 5 minutes. I checked the worksheets the patients had completed. Several of them contained notes referencing the chair exercise, a phrase I had not introduced. One worksheet, in small, careful printing that did not match any patient I knew, said, "Memory works by seating people where they can be found." I asked the nursing desk whether Nolan Wren had been admitted overnight. The weekend charge nurse, Teresa Black, searched the census and said yes. Room 212, but she could not tell me much more because psychiatry was behind on documentation. She said he was quiet, medically stable, and had not required any behavioral intervention. When I asked whether she had seen him, she frowned for a second and said she must have, because she had signed off on the room check at morning med pass. That answer bothered me more than a direct no would have. By noon, I had looked through every active treatment plan on the unit. No Nolan. I checked the room assignment sheet. Room 212 was occupied by a man named Eric Halden, who had been with us for 3 weeks. I went to 212 myself. Eric was in his room assembling a jigsaw puzzle on the desk. No roommate, no second bed turned down, no personal property indicating shared occupancy. The room smelled faintly of hand lotion and nothing else. I told myself the name might belong to a patient temporarily housed on another unit and accidentally left on my group printout. That explanation held until the second weekend. Nolan appeared on every schedule I printed and in no treatment plan I reviewed. Patients referenced him casually. They made space for him at tables. During a meal planning task, Curtis handed a recipe card into empty air and waited until it was apparently returned. During sensory regulation group, Paige laughed softly at something I did not hear and said, "That one's mean, but yes." None of it had the frantic contagion of a shared delusion. The atmosphere in the room stayed calm, structured, almost studious. The unsettling part was what happened after. My documentation remained neat, grammatically correct, and increasingly useless. I wrote notes that seemed complete until I reread them later and found transitions without contents, conclusions without supporting interventions, patient responses that referred to statements I could not remember hearing. Entire blocks of time on the unit began to lose texture. I would leave a group with a strong sense that it had been productive, then discover I could only account in detail for the first and last 10 minutes. Because I am not careless, I changed my process. I began carrying a digital recorder for my own post-session dictation, not to record patients directly without consent, but to preserve my immediate recall while details were fresh. I sharpened my attendance tracking. I saved printed schedules in a binder by date. I started writing the arrangement of chairs on the back of the attendance sheet because it bothered me that one place in the circle never stayed. Fully fixed in my mind, the missingness spread. I lost part of a life roles group on the third weekend of November. I remember handing out laminated daily routine cards. I remember Paige saying she used to hate Sunday evenings because they felt like unfinished hallways. Then I remember standing in the therapy kitchen 27 minutes later, with the cards stacked neatly in my hands, the room empty, and my own progress note already half drafted on the workstation, as though I had written it and forgotten. The note referenced a discussion about borrowed memories in shared environments. The phrase was not clinically standard and not one I would usually write, but it sounded enough like me that I could not dismiss it as fabricated. I went to Teresa again. She listened more seriously that time. She suggested I take a few days off, which was not insulting in itself. Fatigue and secondary trauma are ordinary occupational hazards in psychiatric work. What bothered me was her expression when I asked whether she had personally spoken to Nolan Wren. She blinked, looked toward the ceiling as if trying to locate a file in storage, and said, "I think he talks more to activities than to nursing." That was the kind of answer people give when memory has already begun adapting itself around a gap. I requested access to room cameras for the group spaces. Juniper Crest recorded common areas but not therapy rooms continuously, partly for privacy and partly because private facilities save money anywhere they can. Group Room B, however, had a ceiling camera used mostly for safety review during weekend coverage. Risk Management approved my request after I framed it as a quality concern related to inconsistent attendance documentation. The footage made the problem worse. In the first recording, I watched myself lead coping skills group from the far wall perspective. 6 patients entered, 6 patients sat down. I placed 7 worksheets on the table beside me before group began at minute 12. Every head in the room turned toward the empty chair at my right. My own head turned too. I leaned back slightly, the way people do when listening closely. Then the image glitched, not with static or obvious corruption. More like the file skipped without moving the timestamp in any normal way. One moment my hand was near my lap. The next it was on the whiteboard, halfway through writing the word "anchoring," and the clock in frame had advanced by 9 minutes. The audio did not help. Room microphone quality was terrible even on good days. Still, I could hear voices from the group, chairs shifting, papers sliding. Then a span of soft distortion, not loud enough to qualify as noise. More like the system was recording a room tone that did not belong to the room. We were in. Under it faintly, I could hear my own voice say, "We already did this." A second voice answered. I could not make out the words, but I knew, with the unpleasant certainty people sometimes feel in dreams, that the answer had been meant for me specifically. I reviewed 4 weekends of footage, the pattern repeated. 6 visible patients, 7 handouts, empty chair at my right. Group attention orienting toward absence. Then drift, skip, or compression in the file. In one clip, Paige began passing a basket of grounding objects around the circle. She set it down on the empty chair for a full second before retrieving it, as if waiting for someone there to choose. I went deeper into the scheduling system. Juniper Crest used old rehabilitation software layered over newer charting modules, so one mistake could echo across multiple reports. Nolan Wren appeared not only on group attendance printouts but in archived weekend templates extending back at least 7 years. The same patient identification number recurred, yet when I searched that number in the health record, it returned no active or discharged chart. Not hidden, not restricted. What existed instead were traces. A treatment objective copied from an older template that read, "Improved tolerance for interpersonal silence in group context." An activity log from years before noting that Nolan participated adequately when addressed indirectly. A discharge planning worksheet with every field completed except destination, family contacts, and diagnosis. None of these documents linked cleanly to a full patient account. They floated in the system like fragments waiting for a body. I printed everything and took it to my supervisor, Maribel Kent. She was a competent clinician and an excellent administrator, which meant she had developed the dangerous skill of sounding sympathetic while thinking operationally. She looked over the pages, asked whether I had experienced recent stress outside work, and said the software occasionally carried ghost entries when templates were copied. Forward. I told her ghost entry did not explain the room footage or the way patients interacted with an apparently absent participant. She replied that psychiatric patients often use shared metaphorical frameworks in group, and that my job was to hold structure rather than to literalize every symbol that arose. That sentence followed me for days. Do not literalize every symbol. It is good advice in therapy. It is terrible advice when your own recall is dissolving. I started asking patients neutral questions after group. Had everyone who was supposed to attend shown up? Yes. Did anyone leave early? No. Who sat beside Nolan every time? Could they describe him? That question produced unease. Not fear exactly, more like embarrassment. Curtis said he was the quiet guy. Paige said he had been there a while. Eric from room 212 said he sat near the windows and did the memory stuff. None of them could give me an age, hair color, or anything stable enough to identify a real person. On the first weekend in December, I lost 38 minutes. That is not a metaphor. I checked into work, ran morning chart review, set out materials for coping skills, and entered group room B at 8:55. My next clear memory was standing in the staff restroom at 10:07, washing my hands as if I had just handled paint or flour, though the group had not involved either. My attendance sheet showed 7 present. My note was complete. On the whiteboard in the group room, beneath my own writing about grounding and sequencing, a line had been added in smaller print. What belongs to no one can still be used. I did not recognize the handwriting, but I knew it had been written with one of our dry erase markers because the cap color matched the tray. I called Maribel from the parking lot and told her I was not driving until someone else reviewed what had happened. To her credit, she came in. We watched the footage together. Again, the room held 6 visible patients and 1 empty chair. Again, the group attention gathered toward absence. This time, at the exact point where my memory failed, I saw myself sit down instead of leading. I sat in the empty chair position, facing the rest of the group, while a patch of visual distortion occupied the spot where I had been standing. The patients began speaking to me. Not to the therapist I remembered being, to the seated version, the one in the missing place. The distortion lasted 19 minutes. When it cleared, I was back on my feet, handing out worksheets. Maribel ended the video and said nothing for nearly a full minute. Then she asked whether I had ever been a patient at Juniper Crest. The question felt invasive until I realized why she had asked it. Years earlier, during graduate school, I had completed a brief voluntary stabilization stay after a panic episode that followed my father's death. I had never discussed the facility by name at work because clinicians do not generally bring their own treatment histories into supervision unless necessary. My admission had been short, on a different unit, and in my mind completely separate from my professional life there later. I told Maribel yes. She asked whether my groups during that admission involved autobiographical memory exercises. They had. I had not thought about that in years. We pulled archived program materials from storage. In an older occupational therapy binder from before Juniper Crest renovated its rehab tracks, there had once been a weekend group called Shared Recall. The objective, according to the manual, was to help patients test autobiographical memory by narrating common activities and identifying discrepancies without panic. The program had been discontinued after staff complained that sessions produced lingering disorientation in both patients and facilitators. Attendance examples in the manual used fictional names. One of them was Nolan Wren, not a patient, a placeholder. A stand-in participant used in documentation examples when teaching staff how to chart group interactions. That should have solved everything. It should have reduced the entire experience to software contamination and suggestion. But it did not explain why patients consistently made room for him, why the footage bent around one chair, or why my own missing time increasingly felt less erased than reassigned. The last weekend I worked that unit, I entered group room B before anyone else. I arranged 7 chairs in a circle and placed 7 worksheets on the table. Then I sat in the chair at my right and waited. No dramatic change came over the room. No voice spoke from the walls. The heating system clicked on. Somewhere down the hall, a medication cart rattled over the doorway strip. I almost felt foolish. Then the wall clock advanced by 3 minutes without moving through the seconds between. When I looked down, there was a progress note on my lap in my own handwriting. It described my participation as guarded but improving. It recommended continued attendance until I could reliably distinguish my own memories from those provided by group structure. At the bottom, beneath my signature line, there was another note I had no memory of writing. Someone has to sit where the lost time goes. I resigned from weekend coverage a week later. Officially, I cited burnout and a desire to shift toward outpatient physical rehabilitation. That was partly true. I still work as an occupational therapist. I still believe in routine, structure, and the ordinary repair work of daily life. But I no longer trust an empty chair in a circle, and I no longer assume a schedule belongs only to the people visibly on it. Sometimes, late on Sunday evenings, I look at my calendar and find blank spaces I do not remember leaving. They are not large, 15 minutes 20. Once, nearly 40. Enough time for a useful group session. Enough time for someone quiet to attend, contribute, and leave no treatment plan behind. And when that happens, I have the persistent feeling that somewhere in a room arranged for rehabilitation, the others are still waiting for me to speak. Story 3, Ward C, Bed 7. By the time I opened the archived case conference recording, I already knew the patient in Bed 7 could not be explained by ordinary clinical error. What I had not prepared for was hearing my own voice on a tape dated 6 years before I entered medical school. The sound quality was bad, warped by age and repeated conversion from one storage format to another. But the cadence was mine. The hesitations were mine. Even the way the speaker cleared his throat before disagreeing with an attending physician was mine. On the recording, that voice discussed the long-term management plan for the patient in Ward C, Bed 7. Then the attending asked the resident to state his name for the record, and I heard the answer in perfect clarity. He gave my full name. I was a first-year psychiatry resident in Tacoma, Washington, when the events I am describing took place. The Veterans Psychiatric Hospital where I rotated sat on a rise above the water, not scenic exactly, but exposed enough that the wind coming off the sound reached the older wings with a cold, damp persistence. The buildings were a mix of brick, poured concrete, and institutional renovation. Nothing there was designed to comfort. The place had been expanded in stages through different federal budgets and different philosophies of psychiatric care, so each hallway carried a slightly different moral argument about what patients deserved and what the system believed it could afford. My holiday call block covered Christmas week of 2026. As the most junior resident on the overnight rotation, I inherited cross-cover for acute admissions on one wing and continuity rounds for several long-stay patients on Ward C, the older locked psychiatric unit serving veterans with severe chronic illness, neurocognitive complications, and histories too entangled with institutional life to fit cleanly into shorter treatment models. Overnight on holidays, the hospital quieted in a way I never trusted. Staff was thinner, attendings were off-site. Nursing remained steady, as nursing always does, but the administrative shell around clinical work became faint. The building sounded older after midnight. I had entered psychiatry because I believed, perhaps naively, that language could still do good in medicine. Interviewing mattered. Listening mattered. Formulation mattered. During my first 6 months of residency, I had learned the standard humilities. Patients did not owe coherence. Systems rewarded speed over understanding. Documentation often became the story because it outlived everyone who told it. Still, I remained competent, organized, and reasonably confident in my ability to evaluate a patient, record a mental status examination, and distinguish psychosis from grief, confusion, intoxication, or simple despair. The sign-out list on the evening of December 23rd contained the usual hazards of holiday call. One patient on the acute side had escalating paranoia. Another might require medication adjustment for insomnia. A third was waiting on collateral from family in Spokane. Then, near the bottom, there was a separate note in larger print from the senior resident who had rotated off earlier that day. Ward C, Bed 7. Interview only if clinically necessary. Patient request to meet each incoming resident. Humor him if time allows. Staff knows the situation. That irritated me on principle. There is a certain lazy folklore that accumulates around long-term psychiatric units, especially in older hospitals. This patient is manipulative. That patient knows all the trainees. This room is difficult after dark. Sometimes the folklore encodes real clinical wisdom. Sometimes it functions as a way to avoid fresh thinking. I intended to do my own assessment. The night nurse on Ward C was a broad-shouldered former Navy corpsman named Alan Pritchard, who ran his shift with the quiet efficiency of someone who no longer needed to prove he could handle bad nights. He gave me a concise rundown while we stood at the nursing station beneath a row of old monitors. Bed 3 asleep, bed 5 requesting coffee too often, bed 7 calm, no as needed medication this shift. Asked twice whether the new doctor had arrived. Who is he, I asked. Alan looked down the hall before answering, not theatrically, just habitually. Name in the chart is Thomas Vale, he said. Long term, he's been here in some form for years. Diagnosis list is a mess. Chronic psychosis. Rule out schizoaffective, trauma history, dissociative features according to some attendings. Malingering according to a few who didn't stay long enough to matter. He likes interviewing residents. Why only residents? He says attendings are too settled. That was not a clinical answer, but it was not the strangest thing I had heard on a psychiatric ward. I asked how long Vale had actually been admitted. Alan told me the bed had effectively been his since before Alan himself transferred to nights, which meant at least 8 years. He said there had been discharges, step-downs, returns, and administrative relabeling. But whenever staffing shifted or a service line reorganized, Thomas Vale ended up back in bed 7 as though the hospital had reserved the place for him. The room was halfway down the north hall, across from a locked interview room and 2 doors down from the old solarium that had been converted into a sensory area nobody used. When I entered, Vale was sitting on the side of the bed in hospital pajamas, posture upright, hands resting lightly on his knees. He appeared to be in his late 50s, perhaps early 60s, though institutional living can flatten age into a range rather than a number. His face was narrow, his hair mostly gray, and his expression carried none of the vagueness or suspicion I usually associated with chronic, untreated psychosis. He watched me with the composed attention of a teacher waiting to see whether a student would waste the first question. "Dr. Cole," he said before I introduced myself. "First year, University of Washington track. You take your notes in outline form before you turn them into sentences. My name was Nathan Cole." He was correct on all counts. I did not react visibly or tried not to. Patients learn staff names from badges, overheard conversation, and routine traffic. That was not remarkable, but residency program and note style were not printed on my coat. I introduced myself, confirmed he was oriented to person and place, and began a standard overnight check-in: mood, sleep, appetite, hallucinations, thoughts of harm. He answered each question without resistance and with a precision that would have made him easy to document if not for the oddity of his attention to me. Halfway through, he interrupted to ask whether Dr. Hensley still corrected residents for using the phrase poor insight without behavioral evidence. Dr. Hensley was one of my attendings. He did indeed do that. I asked how Vale knew him. Vale tilted his head slightly, as if I had missed the obvious structure of the interview. "Same way you will," he said, "by repetition." I wrote a short note after the encounter, describing the patient as calm, fully oriented, with no acute behavioral concern and a notable tendency toward familiar over-identification with new trainees. That should have been enough. Overnight coverage is not the place for theoretical indulgence. But when I returned to the call room at 1 in the morning, I found my own note unsettled me. Certain phrases looked as though I had copied them from an older template. Resident appears appropriate for service demands. Recommend continued observation during transition. Those are not sentences I would normally write about a patient. I told myself the hour was affecting my prose. On the following night, Christmas Eve, Vale asked whether I had called my mother yet. I had not. My mother lived in Oregon, and I had delayed phoning because holiday calls during residency tended to make me feel guilt in stereo. I asked why he thought to mention her. He said I always postponed family calls on my first holiday block because you preferred to speak when you could sound rested. The wording scraped against something private, not because it was impossible, because it was familiar in the wrong way. as if I had once said it aloud in his presence. I reviewed the chart more carefully. Long-term psychiatric charts in federal hospitals become sedimentary. New notes lay over old ones, diagnoses accrete. Problem lists survive attendings who no longer work there, and every few years a major software migration partially translates the record into a different language without actually clarifying it. Thomas Vale's chart extended back decades. Names changed, service lines changed. Bed numbers shifted in older documents, yet Bed 7 recurred with eerie consistency after each reorganization, each renovation, each attempt to move him elsewhere. The attending summaries varied wildly. One called him profoundly psychotic with confabulated familiarity towards staff. Another described him as an identity sink for trainee projections. A phrase so unprofessional it should have been removed, but there it was in signed documentation from the early 2000s. Several residents noted that Vale seemed to know personal details he should not know. Just as many residents later appended corrections stating that earlier impressions likely reflected fatigue and holiday stress. Then I noticed something worse. The resident notes across years began to sound like me. Not all of them, but enough to matter. Similar phrasing, similar paragraph flow, the same tendency to qualify broad claims with brief self-corrections. I told myself that medical training standardizes voice. It does. Yet, when I read a note from 6 years earlier stating, patient certainty exerts a destabilizing pull on interview structure, I felt the same unpleasant recognition I had felt hearing an actor use my line readings before I had spoken them. I brought the concern to my senior resident, Priya Dunn, over the phone. She laughed at first, not cruelly, but with the relieved amusement people use when they think you have finally encountered one of the harmless legends every institution develops. She told me Ward C always had one patient who got under intern skin. She advised me to sleep between calls, keep notes simple, and avoid getting flattered by a chronic patient who had likely spent years studying every new doctor for entertainment. That was good advice. I would even give similar advice now. It stopped helping on Christmas night. During overnight rounds, Alan asked whether I had already seen Bed 7. I told him not yet. He looked at the clipboard in his hand, frowned, and said he could have sworn he heard voices from the room 20 minutes earlier. We checked together. Vale was alone, sitting by the window. Snow had begun falling lightly over the courtyard. He asked Alan whether the coffee in the staff room was still burnt. Alan, who prided himself on not feeding patient theatrics, gave him a thin smile and said it always was. Then Vale turned to me and said, "You are remembering the wrong cadaver lab. My father had been a carpenter, not a physician. No one in my family worked in medicine. I had never spoken on the unit about medical school beyond the standard harmless complaints. Yet in that moment I had indeed been thinking about anatomy lab, or rather about a smell from the corridor that had briefly taken me back there. I asked him what he meant. He looked genuinely concerned for me. "You keep reaching for the first-year memory with the skylight," he said. "That belonged to Eric. Yours had no windows. I can explain many things through suggestion. I cannot explain the sensation that passed through me then. Not fear exactly, more like intellectual vertigo, because he had named, with complete confidence, a discrepancy I had only recently begun noticing in myself. My memories of medical school had acquired tiny contradictions over the previous week. Nothing dramatic, an attending name slightly wrong, a lecture hall I could picture but could not place, a classmate whose face came readily to mind, though when I searched alumni photos later, no such person appeared. These were the kinds of slips exhaustion can produce, until someone else described them before you did. I stopped sleeping well after that. Each time I closed my eyes in the call room, I would wake with the strong sense that I had been dreaming an interview from the wrong side of the chair. I began carrying a pocket notebook separate from the chart, something I could write in immediately after each encounter without institutional phrasing intruding. On one page I wrote a list of things I knew with certainty: my parents' names, college in Vermont, medical school in Seattle, first panic attack at age 17 after a highway rollover. I looked at the list every few hours. By the second day, it no longer felt reassuring. It felt defensive. I spent the daylight hours after post-call in medical records. Federal archives move slowly unless you keep asking. I requested prior holiday coverage notes for Ward C and specifically every resident evaluation mentioning Bed 7. What emerged was not one long coherent case history but a repeating event structure. Each Christmas block or year-end staffing transition, the incoming resident interviewed Vale. Each interview generated comments about unusual familiarity, destabilizing countertransference, or patient comments that seemed to anticipate confidential supervision. Then, in many cases, the resident later amended the note, downplaying the significance. A few transferred services shortly after. One left psychiatry altogether. Several became attendings elsewhere. That alone proved nothing. Residency changes people for ordinary reasons, but tucked into an old education file, I found something worse than any patient note. It was a faculty evaluation form for a resident named Daniel Mercer, dated 1998. The attending had written, "Strong rapport on Ward C, though concerning identification with Bed 7 patient. Resident occasionally refers to unit history as if personally involved." Attached to the form was a photo from a holiday luncheon. 4 staff stood around a folding table with stale cookies and a paper banner. One resident stood at the edge, badge half visible. He had my face. Not exactly. Close enough that I first assumed the photograph quality was distorting ordinary resemblance. But the longer I looked, the less the differences held. Same brow line, same mouth when uncertain, same habit of standing with the right shoulder slightly forward. The badge was too blurred to read. I took the photo to Alan that night. He studied it for a long time. "That's Mercer," he said, "before my time. But I know the name. People still mention him in the old case conferences. He looks like me." Alan did not answer immediately. Then he said, "More than I like." We went to the basement records room together during a lull after 1 in the morning. Ward C had existed through several eras of documentation, and not all of it had been digitized cleanly. Old case conference audio, teaching tapes, handwritten staffing summaries, and morbidity review packets sat in labeled gray boxes under humming fluorescent strips that made every file seem already exhumed. We found Mercer's conference materials in a box marked Resident Education Holiday Rotation. That was the tape I described at the beginning. The attending voice on the recording discussed long-term placement barriers, chronic identity disturbance, and the therapeutic risks of over-engaging Bed 7's narrative structure. Then a resident responded in a cadence I recognized as my own. When the attending asked him to identify himself, he gave my full name. I sat very still after the tape ended. Alan asked if I was all right. I told him I did not know what the question meant anymore. There are several rational explanations one could attempt there. Clerical mislabeling, later dubbing, software corruption during archival conversion. I considered all of them. None accounted for the residue accumulating in my own mind. Over that week, details of my life had begun to exchange places. I could still remember my mother, but sometimes her kitchen had my aunt's wallpaper. I could still picture my college, but twice I described its library to myself in features borrowed from a building in Seattle. When I tried to recall my first day of residency, I now pictured not the conference room I actually used, but the old Ward C report room with wood paneling that had been removed before I ever worked. There I confronted Vale on the final night of my holiday block, not dramatically. Psychiatric training, even destabilized training, does not fully leave you. I sat in the interview chair, kept my voice even, and told him I had reviewed old records. I told him I had found references to residents identifying with him. I told him there was a recording in which a man using my name discussed his case before I was born into medicine. Then I asked the only question that seemed worth asking. "What are you doing to us?" Vale regarded me with something that might have been pity. "You make that sound active," he said. "I am where the unfinished doctors go." I said that was not an answer. "It is if you know what a hospital does with repetition." He leaned back slightly and looked past me at the observation window in the door. "Every institution trains replacements," he said. "Residents for attendings, new nurses for old nurses, charts for memories. When the handoff is clean, nothing lingers. When it is not, someone keeps the excess. Ward C has been keeping excess a very long time. This is the part that still troubles me because he did not speak like a psychotic patient producing grand metaphor. He spoke like someone explaining a policy to a colleague who should already know it. He told me residents came to bed 7 because trainees are unfinished by design, still forming, still porous. The hospital, he said, noticed that. The bed noticed that. He said some people lost nothing more than a phrase or a preference. Some lost whole stretches of self and called it professional development. A few left more than they took. I asked who Daniel Mercer was. Vale smiled without warmth. You were closest to him, he said. I should have ended the interview. Instead, I asked what he meant. Vale nodded toward the chart in my hand. Read the handwriting, not the name. Back at the nursing station. I pulled Mercer's old evaluation copies beside my own recent notes. The names differed. The handwriting did not, or rather, Mercer's late notes moved toward mine the way a practiced imitation becomes less imitation with time. There were loops on the lowercase letters I knew from my own hand, marginal arrows I used habitually when revising formulations. A tiny break in the capital N of Nathan that appeared once in a scanned signature from years before I had ever signed anything in that building. At 4 in the morning, I went to the resident workroom to call Priya. My badge would not open the door. I tried again. Red light. I went to the staff elevator. Red light there too. Alan found me a minute later and asked why I was standing in the hall. I told him my badge access was failing. He looked at the badge clipped to my coat and went very quiet. Then he said, gently, as though orienting a patient, "Doctor badges are blue, mine was white. White was patient access." I do not remember the next several minutes in a clean sequence. I remember Alan guiding me toward the nursing station instead of the exit. I remember him saying he needed me to sit down. I remember glancing at the central board and seeing bed 7 under active census with the name Nathan Cole typed where Thomas Vale had been earlier. I remember another line beneath it showing Thomas Vale as attending interview completed. When I say that now, I know how it sounds. A psychotic break, acute stress reaction, sleep deprivation with derealization. I considered all of that. I still consider it. But there are facts that remain stubborn. My personal phone contained messages from my mother addressing me as Nathan. My apartment key still fit my apartment. My medical school diploma exists. Yet 2 days after Christmas, Employee Health had no immunization file under my name. Graduate medical education could confirm I was on roster, but my orientation photo in the system showed a face that looked like mine after an illness I do not remember having. And in the Ward C chart, the historical note sequence no longer began with Thomas Vale. It began decades earlier with a partially scanned admission under a different name. Daniel Mercer. I finished residency. That is perhaps the strangest part. Institutions are capable of absorbing enormous irregularities if they can still move schedules forward. I remained in the program because the program said I remained in the program. Some files corrected themselves over the following months. Some did not. Priya later told me I looked different after Christmas week, not physically at first glance, but in habits too small to list. I stopped taking notes in outline form. I began preferring a brand of tea I had never liked before. Supervisor once commented that my countertransference language sounded unusually old for my training year. I never went back to Ward C alone. Thomas Vale was eventually documented as transferred, then as discharged to a lower level of care, then as historical only. The bed kept its number. Staff still refer to it with a pause before the name, as if deciding which one they mean. I practice now in another state. I maintain licensure. I teach interviewing to residents with what I hope is ordinary caution. I tell them identity in psychiatry is not a fixed instrument. It is a method under pressure. Most hear that as theory, which is probably for the best. But each December I review my own credentials, old photos, and personal history with a thoroughness no sane man should need. I can account for nearly everything. Nearly. There remain certain memories that do not sit correctly in me. A holiday potluck in a room I should never have seen. An attending whose correction I remember receiving years before we met. The smell of old federal carpeting in a basement archive on a night that may not have belonged entirely to my life. If there is any conclusion to offer, it is only this. Hospitals train us to believe that continuity is preserved through records, handoffs, and supervised observation. I once believed that too. Now I think some institutions preserve continuity by other means. They do not merely remember the people who pass through them. They keep the unfinished parts. And if you arrive at the wrong time still becoming yourself, They may decide you have enough extra to leave behind.